Znači, sljedeća tema nam je senzorno-integrativne aktivnosti, rana intervencija i školska dob. Moderator nam je Dora Marinić, edukacijska rehabilitatorica, tako da prepuštam sada Dori riječ i nastavljamo sa konferencijom.
Pozdrav svima. Hvala organizatorima na pozivu. Velika mi je čast moderirati ovu jako zanimljivu sekciju. Vjerujem da ćemo jako puno toga dobiti i čuti kroz ovih nekih sati i pol vremena koliko je pred nama. Ja ne bih dužila, na početku ću odmah najaviti našu plenarnu predavačicu Mim Ochsenbein iz STAR instituta, pedijatrijski radni terapeut koja će nam govoriti o temi uvod u dinamiku senzornog procesuiranja, regulacije i odnosa. Plenarno predavanje, kao što ste vidjeli, trajat će 30 minuta, nakon čega ide vrijeme za pitanje i odgovore. Slobodno pišite svoja pitanja u chat, a ja ću ih pratiti i na kraju postaviti našoj plenarnoj predavačici. Mim, dobrodošli i preuzimate riječ.
Thank you so much for having me. Can everyone hear me? Yes. It's my honor to be part of this conference. As Dora said, my name is Mim. I am an occupational therapist and social worker. I'm also the director of education for the STAR Institute here in Denver, Colorado in the U.S. And though I'm originally from Los Angeles, but I'm going to share a very brief presentation with you about the importance of what we call the triad of sensory processing, regulation, and relationship that we feel is of the utmost importance for the work we do with clients and families. So hopefully I can share my screen. Can everyone see that? Is it working for everyone?
Yes, we can.
Excellent, thank you. STAR Institute is a nonprofit. Also, internationally, it would be considered an NGO. And here at STAR, we focus on providing treatment, research, and education around sensory processing and sensory health and wellness. So thank you for allowing us to be part of this. And this is just to thank all of the STAR faculty members and our founder, Dr. Lucy J. Miller, for contributing to these concepts and what I'm going to share with you today. So in the next few minutes, we're going to hopefully explain the bidirectional nature of sensory processing, regulation, and relationship, understand how this very dynamic system can support or derail development throughout the lifespan, and understand the role of the sensory integration, sensory processing therapist and the therapy itself in supporting particularly children in this talk with sensory processing needs. Okay. So as what we refer to here in the U.S. as allied health professionals, which include occupational therapy, physiotherapy, speech therapy in particular, as well as other helping professions like special education specialists, etc. We're all looking at and providing support for our clients to develop the skills that support the process of childhood, daily growth and play, learning, and relationship development. All of that is in the name of participation, being able to participate at home, in the schools, and in the community. But we must remember where we are going with this kind of work. The end game of all the work that we do as providers is for the child, the client, to flourish, to realize and express their authentic selves, to be part of their lives on their terms rather than having their lives happen to them. The combination of these component parts that you see allows us to engage in valued occupational roles, engage positively with people and objects, and have successful participation in social contexts. When a person engages in purposeful activities out of personal choice, and they are valued activities, these clusters of purposeful activities form what we call occupations. And then these activities, they carry meaning and are, by definition, as a result, intrinsically motivating. When personal meaning and intrinsic motivation are both present, supporting development becomes a lot easier from the role of the clinician or parent. The outcomes that are achieved are better and more robust, and the gains remain longer. So as a result, we have these much larger positive outcomes, like development of a positive sense of self, a sense of agency, and of enjoying other people. We have function, we have participation and engagement in multiple contexts. We have independence and we have interdependence. And that's important because as humans, we are not designed to be independent in all things. We are interdependent on one another. We ask and expect and need help and support from other humans in our personal world. And we need to support our children in developing those skills, recognizing that need, and how to be interdependent as well as independent in some of their own skills and processes. There we go. So at STAR, we believe in sensory processing and integration, relationship, and regulation as the three principal domains of human development. And we use this strong foundation of this triad to climb and to develop higher level skills. So clearly, sensory integration and sensory processing is one of these three principal domains. When we do this kind of work with children, we are actually addressing all three domains simultaneously. And when we do that, and we do it with purpose, and we do it thoughtfully, the outcome for the child is integration of the physiological, neurobiological, and affective systems. Regulation is the foundation of development. Relationship drives development, and sensory processing and integration organizes development. As you can see by the graphic and the arrows, these three domains are interdependent, bidirectional, influencing, supporting, or potentially derailing one another. And this occurs because three foundations exist in a dynamic system. So a little bit on dynamic systems. Dynamic system theories view development as continuous, though not necessarily progressing in an orderly fashion. So there may be multiple parallel ways to reach the same point. This figure on the slide illustrates the path taken by a given child will depend on the child's unique combination of personal and environmental circumstances, including cultural diversity in development. So we can explore each of the three domains using this dynamic system lens. For example, sensory processing. With sensory processing, you have component parts of that sensory processing system, right? And those component parts are the individual sensory systems like vision, hearing, etc. But these systems exist in a broader milieu of multiple systems, including regulation and relationship, but sensory motor, cognition, physiological systems within the body, like hormones and breathing, neurochemical systems of the brain, and they all have innumerable transactions, multi-directional relationships and influences moment to moment. So this is a very holistic view of the body-brain relationship, and how they all interact, all the systems of the body and brain interact with one another through these innumerable transactions and these multi-directional relationships which influence us second to second, actually. All right, also something we have to understand is that the sensory systems or sensory processing is how we make meaning of our worlds, right? So this is a quote from Muller and Tronick, who are actually both attachment theorists. To make meaning out of the world and successfully engage with the environment requires the ability to perceive sensory information from the world and integrate that information in meaningful ways into states of consciousness, which then thrusts the individual into the world with appropriate actions. We need to be able not to just take in the information, but make meaning out of it. And to do that, we have to be regulated, right? We must be regulated to take in and interpret that sensory information and then use it in an efficient and effective manner. When we're in a relationship with another, and here I will define relationship as meaning being connected to another person, right, on a deep emotional level. When we are in relationship, that sensory information takes on more saliency. There's more context, and it's more readily laid down in the brain circuitry. So all three domains are needed to make meaning, and meaning provides purpose. So we have to utilize energy to garner information, to create complexity, and complexly organized, coherent, integrated, and flexible states of consciousness. These states of consciousness are psychobiological states that contain private meanings to an individual and creates their place in the world. So a little bit about sensory processing in of itself. As we've stated, we believe that sensory processing and integration organizes development, provides meaning. Right? As most of you are probably already familiar with sensory processing and integration, this will be very brief. So this is a quick review of a very simplistic idea of how this works. Sensation comes in, it's registered, interpreted, first for safety and then for detail, and then integrated with other information that's simultaneously coming in from other sensory channels, from our memories, and our emotions. That leads us to develop a plan for a response. Right? So over here, everything from the motor plan of maybe the whole body to maybe it's simply changing your facial expression or creating a speech response, which, when you get down to it, speech is motor. This leads to an adaptive response, which then provides feedback to the body and the systems. The feedback is based on more sensory information, and the cycle just begins again. Here we go. So sensory processing should be viewed as a dimension of health and well-being. If we can see our way clear to that, then we can look at disordered sensory processing or sensory processing challenges, not as discrete needs that need to be fixed, but rather as a vital component to a very complicated organism's systems. So issues in sensory processing and their impacts are very subjective, meaning that it's wholly dependent on the individual and the systems that they exist in to determine if the impacts are significantly impeding participation, functionality, or engagement in preferred occupations and roles. There's no checklist. This is not black and white thinking. These presentations of disordered sensory processing should be viewed from this dimensional thinking perspective, how each subtype could potentially be causal or at least partially responsible for impacts in engagement, participation, and function. So if we think of development like our blocks here, right, this would be ideal. Firm foundation at the bottom that allows for the highest tower to most stably be built. But for a lot of the children we work with, we get something that looks more like this. There are holes in some of those foundational skills and capacities. It still allows us to build our tower pretty high, right, to access some higher level functions here. But the stability is in question. And if challenged, the whole thing can fall apart. And we lose a lot of those higher level functions that we are capable of. So this is a quote from STAR's founder, Dr. Lucy J. Miller, that sensory processing is actually a means to an end, and the end is quality of life. The end goal of sensory integration and sensory processing is more than an absence of dysfunctional sensory processing or issues. It's more than enhancing motor development. It's psychological, it's about well-being, and it's about flourishing. So what is the goal of sensory integration therapy? The goal is to increase function and participation, to help the individual realize their potential. We want to have goal-oriented behaviors that are that individual's goals. We want to support self-regulation and self-directed, self-organized behaviors that are coming from the child and their wants and needs. We want them to enjoy other people and be able to take perspective. That's a human trait, and we want to make sure that we're supporting that. We want to support positive and harmonious social relationships, particularly within the family. We want to support psychological well-being and flourishment. And we want children who are self-controlling, right? They monitor themselves and can be active social agents. So resiliency, sure, problem solving, engagement, not just independence, but true interdependence. We want learning to occur, learning through play, learning through relationship, learning at school and through activities, through sports and recreation. The question becomes, what is the child learning as they engage without adequate supports? So the role of the clinician then is quite specific. Sensory integration theory fits very well into our current understanding of interpersonal neurobiology, which is this holistic view of wellness based on a holistic view of the body-brain relationship as a dynamic system. Top down, bottom up, inside out, outside in. So we need our therapists to be detectives, to look beyond observable behaviors to brain-based processing and look under the surface and ask the question, always ask the question, why? Why is this struggle occurring? We want our therapists to recognize the role of the brain and body and environment and relationship interactions and function and engagement and participation, the whole thing. So let's take a quick look at disordered sensory processing so we're all on the same page. This will be very brief. So now that we've talked about typical sensory processing and its role, it's time to talk about atypical sensory processing. This is a really brief overview, and the numbers that you see here are actually from the States and could be very different for European populations, but I thought I'd share these because this is what we currently have. Right now we know that disordered sensory processing is an inability to effectively register, process, and organize sensory information for that meaningful, purposeful use. In the US, we have different studies that show that 5 to 16% of all children who have no other diagnosis would qualify for disordered sensory processing. Actually, it's the 16% number that is used more often. It is a more robust number. We also know now that disordered sensory processing is a very common co-occurring condition in many neurodivergent and mental health presentations, including autism, where it is been studied that I think 95 to 98% of autistics also have disordered sensory processing. Roughly 40% of individuals with ADHD have sensory processing differences, as do gifted and talented children, about a third of those. It's common with anxiety. It's common in schizophrenia, in bipolar disorder, etc. However, sensory processing disorder can also stand alone, where a child has no other co-occurring condition. So it's important to note that each sensory system listed here can, and often does, have a different presentation in a child who has sensory processing differences. For example, you could have a child who has sensory over-responsivity in the vestibular system and is also visually under-responsive and also has tactile discrimination disorder. So they are complex presentations. It is not a one-size-fits-all. The reason we care so much about sensory processing differences, especially when they are disordered, is that sensory processing affects engagement, participation, self-regulation, social development, self-esteem, overall health and well-being and success. And we are getting more and more studies in the United States around adults who had sensory processing issues as children that may or may not have been adequately addressed, and the mental health issues and the quality of life issues they are having as adults as a result. So this is very important stuff when we talk about the lifespan. This is a diagram of what we call the sensory processing nosology, developed by Dr. Miller et al., where it breaks down the different categories of disordered sensory processing. The subtypes are applicable, as I said, to a sensory system, not an entire person, meaning a system can be identified by the subtype, like over-responsive or under-responsive. But you don't talk about an individual as being over-responsive in all ways. This is a living, breathing model, and there's a lot of ongoing research, and it will likely change over the next 5 to 10 years as we learn more. So the first area we always talk about is sensory modulation disorders, of which there are 3 types. So sensory modulation disorders are when we have difficulty regulating our responses to sensory input. Our responses are not appropriately adjusted to the situation. We have a hard time achieving and maintaining optimal ranges of arousal being physiological readiness to act. And as a result, we have difficulties and challenges in daily life. To have a modulation disorder, the issue must be severe enough to disrupt the ability to adapt to challenges in daily life. And these disorders include over-responsivity, under-responsivity, and sensory craving. And this is a quick summary of each of those. Sensory over-responsivity is when we neurologically respond too much, too frequently, or for too long to a particular sensory stimulation like sound or touch or movement, for example. Sensory under-responsivity is when the nervous system is less sensitive and less aware of the sensory stimulation compared to most other people. And then sensory craving is when we seem to want or need sensory input much more than others. However, when we get that particular form of input, it actually causes more problems for us instead of helping us. It doesn't organize us. It actually is more dysregulating for us. These are some common sensory over-responsivity presentations in children. You can probably imagine what each system is involved with here. But when we are overstimulated by sensory stimulation, we become upset by transitions and unexpected changes. We might become aggressive or impulsive, irritable, fussy, and moody. We might be unsociable. We avoid group activities. We have trouble forming relationships. And we might appear excessively cautious or afraid to try new things, well beyond what's expected for a child at a certain age. Often parents will label children who have sensory over-responsivities as that they were a fussy baby or a difficult baby to calm. These are some presentations of what sensory under-responsivity can look like. When in the presence of sensation, these individuals may appear withdrawn. They are very difficult to engage in conversation or other social interactions. They might appear lethargic, passive, easily lost in their own fantasy world. They may even seem apathetic to others or to situations. They are very slow to respond to directions or complete work assignments. They have generally a poor inner drive. They're uninterested in exploring games or objects or the world around them. And then we have sensory craving. This particular subtype is still controversial, and we don't have a lot of evidence on it yet. But what we hypothesize is that these children...
Mim, I'm sorry, 2 minutes left, okay?
Oh, gosh, okay, good. I'm not even going to spend a lot of time on sensory craving then, because it's a, yeah. So let's keep going. So sensory-based motor disorder is when we have issues in our vestibular and proprioceptive systems, and the result is typically that we can have a postural disorder where we have difficulty maintaining control of our bodies to meet the demands of a given motor task, or dyspraxia, where we have planning issues with motor, and then discrimination issues that impacts interpretation of sensory information. And this can also result in dysregulation. Okay. And usually we have difficulty with the spatial, temporal aspects, the intensity, the duration, or the unique characteristics of a particular system. So regulation is the foundation of development, and we define it as how we shift and maintain states according to the demands of the environment. So here I've listed what regulation can look like and what dysregulation could look like for a child. And these are just some of the presentations you might have. So when we say engaged with the environment, that means that you're invested and interested. And when you're disengaged, there's no emotional connection. So think about what regulation could look like. Actually, let's do that. And that you can be moving and still be regulated. This one, though, I want to be sure to get to. So this is about our regulation cup. And it's important for us to think about all the things that impact us all the time and require us to respond to. And that for our kids, they have small cups. And so we have to be careful what we are putting into the cup, as well as making sure we have a way to empty the cup so we don't cause dysregulation. So if you think about all the things that go into the cup, during your treatments, what can you remove to make it easier for the child to stay regulated and focus on the challenge you're presenting to them? For example, often removing language when we're engaging in motor can be very, very helpful for the child. And then this is my way of explaining how dysregulation occurs with all the sensory subtypes. When we have modulation disorders, we are directly impacting the autonomic nervous system. That information, if you're over-responsive or under-responsive or craving, goes to lower subcortical areas of the brain. That immediately puts us into states of dysregulation. So it's our bullet train. Whereas with praxis and posture issues and discrimination issues, the information we get is more like a commuter train. We bring in information to the brain and it makes stops at different places of the brain for evaluation and causes us to have different emotional states such as confusion, frustration, or even embarrassment. And then that causes us to become dysregulated. If we have that experience often enough, the child will perceive a situation immediately as problematic and go straight to dysregulation. So their commuter train that used to make a lot of stops in the brain now is a bullet train to dysregulation. And then we have the importance of regulation and relationship, where we learn how to regulate ourselves in relationship with others, particularly in infancy. Children acquire the ability to self-regulate by first being regulated by another, which is what this diagram shows. The Sharp point being the infant's ability to self-regulate, and then through the lifespan, more ability to regulate because of the interactions we have with our caregiver, our peers, and our partners that support us. We need co-regulation to develop self-regulation. And come on. That takes us to relationship, which drives our development, because that's the context of childhood. We don't have development without relationships. And we demonstrate that when we think about Wi-Fi. So we understand the invisible nature of Wi-Fi, but we have this kind of Wi-Fi with each other as humans. There is a brain-to-brain connection that occurs between a child and their caregiver, and it's fundamental to development. We know that through a lot of studies. When we have sensory processing problems, that can create or sever this connection in relationship, because the information we're sharing with one another now may be scrambled. It might change the quality of the information, or we might only be transmitting or taking in part of that information. It cuts off the signal altogether potentially, or it could add a lot of extra information that's confusing between the two. And so this just demonstrates that a lot of how we develop attachment and bonds really is dependent on sensory information. The sound of our voice, our gestures, our body movement, our posture, our coordinated eye-to-eye gazing, and our facial expressions. These are all forms of sensory and sensory motor information that we use to strengthen or understand relationship better. And then this diagram just demonstrates.
Sorry, Mim, can we bring it to an end?
That's it. That was it. So here, I'll jump to here. Thank you.
Hvala puno, Mim. Thank you, Mim. Mislim da smo stvarno imali priliku čuti ovoj vrijedne informacije o ovoj trijadi i o tome koliko je zapravo sve u jednoj velikoj međuovisnosti i kako nam je zapravo taj cilj dostizanje kvalitete života, a ne samo izvedba nekih senzomotoričkih aktivnosti. I mislim da si to uvijek trebamo ponavljati i posebno onda naglasiti tu našu ulogu terapeuta u tom svemu i kakvi su naši zadaci, kako mi to možemo promatrati. I baš mi se svidio onaj dio gdje Mim govori o tome kako smo zapravo pravi detektivi u tom istraživanju. I hvala Mim puno, s obzirom da smo